The canonization of Carlo Acutis was one of the most anticipated and moving events in the recent history of the Catholic Church. Millions of people around the world followed every piece of news related to this young man who, despite having died at 15, left an indelible mark for his profound love of the Eucharist and his unique way of living the faith in the digital age. His elevation to the altars represented not only an official recognition of his holiness, but also a sign of hope for an entire generation of Catholics who feel he is a close, modern, and accessible saint. However, in the midst of the celebrations, speeches, and headlines, there was a detail that went almost unnoticed, a gesture, a sign, something that the Vatican did not publicly highlight with the force it deserved, but which, for many of the faithful, has a profound meaning. And this is where the story becomes even more fascinating, because what seems small in the eyes of the world can become a revealing sign for those who know how to look with faith. The ceremony in St. Peter's Basilica was filled with symbols, the solemn chants, the presented relics, the portrait of Carlo displayed before thousands of pilgrims. Everything seemed carefully prepared to emphasize the greatness of this moment. Yet some attentive observers noticed something more, a detail that was not mentioned in the official speeches, that did not appear in the press releases, but that was there for all to see. It was an intentional silence, a gesture the Vatican preferred not to fully explain, or simply one of those wonders that God allows for the eyes of faith to recognize. The answer isn't simple, but the truth is that this hidden detail has sparked intense conversations among those who were present and those who followed the canonization on television or the internet. Before we go deeper into this, I want to extend a special invitation. Leave a comment with the moment from Carlo Acutis' canonization that moved you the most, or what his example of life means to you. I am very interested to know your opinion, because the canonization of a saint is not just a liturgical event, but also a spiritual experience that each believer lives in a unique way. Returning to the event, it is important to remember that every canonization is an act charged with symbolism. It is not just about publicly proclaiming that someone lived in holiness. It is also a way of transmitting messages to the universal church. Canonized saints are models of life, intercessors, and in a way, signs of what God wants to emphasize in each era. In Carlo's case, the message seems obvious: to show the world that holiness is not a thing of the past or reserved for monasteries or great figures, but that it can be lived in the very heart of youth and in the most modern environments. That is why any detail within the ceremony takes on special weight. And the gesture that went unnoticed was no exception. Those who recognized it claim that there is a message from God for our time. It is not something spectacular or a visible miracle, but a silent, subtle, but profoundly revealing sign. Some have pointed out that this detail has to do with the relic presented at the ceremony. Others believe it is related to the presence of certain young people chosen to participate in a special way in the liturgy. And there are those who claim that it was a gesture of prayer or devotion within the ceremony that did not receive an official explanation, but did not go unnoticed by those who were paying attention. Whatever the interpretation, the important thing is to understand that in the life of the Church, nothing is casual, especially in a canonization that has captured the attention of the entire world. The Vatican's silence on this detail should not necessarily be interpreted as concealment in a negative sense, but as an invitation to look with the eyes of faith, to discover that God manifests himself in the small, in what does not receive applause, in what remains hidden from the superficial gaze. This is the great challenge of our time, learning to look with spiritual eyes. Carlo Acutis understood this perfectly. He said that the Eucharist is my highway to heaven, and with that simple phrase, he taught entire generations to value the essential. Perhaps that incredible detail that went unnoticed is a way of reminding us of the same thing, that what is truly great is not always in the visible, in what the media highlights, but in the hidden, in what only God and attentive hearts can recognize. So begins our exploration of what the Vatican did not highlight in the canonization of Carlo Acutis. A simple gesture, yes, but one that contains a profound meaning for the Church of today. In the following parts, we will discover what it was all about, what interpretations have arisen, and why so many of the faithful consider this silent detail to be a message from heaven. In every canonization, the relic of the new saint occupies a central place. It is a visible sign of the connection between heaven and earth, between a life of holiness and the intercession that is now officially recognized. In the case of Carlo Acutis, the presented relic was his heart, preserved as a palpable testimony of his burning love for the Eucharist. The Vatican spoke about it, yes, but what many did not notice was the way this gesture was integrated into the ceremony, accompanied by a detail that received no public explanation. Those who were present are sure that when the relic was carried in procession, a moment of silence occurred that was not in the planned script. The chanting stopped for a few seconds longer than usual, and the assembly remained in deep reverence. There were no indications from the microphones or subsequent explanations. It was as if the entire liturgy wanted to briefly stop, letting that heart speak for itself. The Vatican did not mention this fact in its official communications, and in the television broadcast it went almost unnoticed. But for the faithful who were attentive, that silence had an immense symbolic weight. It was a silence that shouted, a space where many felt the closeness of God in a special way. Some testimonies speak of spontaneous tears, of a feeling of peace that is difficult to describe, as if Carlo himself had been present, reminding everyone that his heart, now a relic, continues to beat spiritually in the Church. Why was this not mentioned in the official speeches? Perhaps because it was not something planned, perhaps because the Church wanted to leave it in discretion so as not to divert attention from the essential part of the canonization. But precisely because of that discretion, the gesture gained more strength. It was like a hidden gift reserved for those who know how to look beyond the obvious. This is the incredible detail we are referring to. It is not about a visible miracle or an extraordinary sign, but an unexpected silence full of spiritual meaning that accompanied the presentation of the relic of Carlo Acutis. A silence that the Vatican did not publicly highlight, but which for many was a sign from heaven. In biblical tradition, silences have always played a fundamental role. God does not manifest himself only in thunder or fire, but in the gentle breeze, in the voice that is barely heard, in the intimacy of the heart. That silence at the canonization reminded many that Carlo lived in that way, without seeking noise or protagonism, with a simple but profound faith, with a hidden and persevering love for the Eucharist that today inspires the world. Some of the faithful interpreted that moment as a divine message. Holiness does not need grandiloquent words. A surrendered heart is enough. And indeed, wasn't that the core of Carlo's life? His passion for Jesus in the Eucharist was not expressed with speeches but with daily gestures, participating in daily Mass, spending hours in adoration, organizing exhibitions on Eucharistic miracles with the means he had at his disposal. Everything about him was simple, but at the same time, extraordinary. The hidden detail during the canonization is, in a way, a prolongation of that same spirituality. A silent moment that became a sermon more powerful than any homily. A pause in the liturgy that, without official explanation, was transformed into a direct message to the hearts of those present. After the ceremony, some bishops and priests who attended commented to each other on the meaning of that silence. One of them, interviewed by a Catholic media outlet, described it as a providential pause, a parenthesis from God in the midst of the solemnity. There were no official statements, but those who were there know it was something unique, unrepeatable. It is probable that the Vatican chose not to give it too much diffusion to prevent excessive interpretations from arising. However, the fact that it was not mentioned publicly made many perceive it as a hidden detail, something that went unnoticed by the cameras but deeply marked those who lived it. Here we find a key lesson. Holiness is revealed in details, not always in great gestures or official speeches, but in what remains hidden, in what is not said, in the moments of silence that speak more than 1,000 words. Carlo Acutis, canonized in the midst of the solemnity of Rome, was also honored with that silence that reflected his simple, discreet, but profoundly transformative lifestyle. Dear viewer, now I want to ask you a direct question. Have you ever experienced a silence from God that spoke to you more strongly than any word? Share it in the comments, because I believe that in your personal experience we can discover together how God continues to act in the hidden, in what does not appear in the headlines, but changes lives in a silent way. That is the incredible detail that the Vatican did not highlight, but that remains as a sign for those who know how to see with the eyes of faith. And the most amazing thing is that it was not an accident, but a perfect echo of Carlo's life, a young man who, with humility and simplicity, knew how to show that the essential is not always announced with a great noise, but is discovered in the small and in the hidden. The relic of Carlo Acutis' heart, solemnly presented at the canonization ceremony, was the center of the liturgical and spiritual attention of that day. It is not common for a saint's relic to be their heart. And in this case, that detail contains a profound symbolism. The heart is the organ that beats, that gives life, that holds the essence of the person. And in Carlo's case, that heart was the engine of an immense love for Christ in the Eucharist. From a very young age, Carlo had shown an extraordinary devotion. He participated daily in Holy Mass and dedicated long hours to Eucharistic adoration. He did not do it out of obligation or to feign holiness, but because he had understood the essential truth that the Eucharist is the center of the Christian life, the place where heaven and earth meet. He himself said, "When we stand in front of the sun, we get a tan, but when we stand in front of Jesus in the Eucharist, we become saints." These simple and direct words reveal the secret of his spirituality. That is why his heart being preserved as a relic is not a simple biological detail, but a theological message. It is as if God himself wanted to emphasize that everything in Carlo revolved around Eucharistic love. His young body, marked by the illness that led to his death at 15, became a testimony of a heart that did not live for itself but for Christ. During the canonization, when the heart was carried in procession, many perceived the strength of this symbol. It was as if that heart, which once beat with youthful passion, was now beating again for the entire Church, reminding everyone that the true source of life is not in human successes or in the technology that Carlo so enjoyed, but in Christ, present in the Eucharist. The silent detail that accompanied the presentation of the relic, that moment of unexplained pause, connects directly with this meaning. It was as if the liturgy itself had wanted to stop to let the heart speak. There was no need for explanations or speeches. The presence of that heart, a silent witness to a love that the Church now proclaims as holy, was enough. In the days following the canonization, several of the faithful shared testimonials on social media and in Catholic media. Some spoke of having felt an unusual peace upon seeing the relic. Others reported that in that moment they made important decisions for their spiritual lives, returning to confession, resuming Sunday Mass, dedicating more time to prayer. It is impressive how such a simple gesture can become a seed of conversion. Here we find one of the keys to Carlo's life, his ability to evangelize without words, to show the face of Christ with simple gestures. During his earthly life, he did it by creating a digital exhibition on Eucharistic miracles, by sharing the importance of Mass with his friends, by living the faith with joy. After his death, he does it through his heart, preserved as a relic, which continues to transmit the same message. Jesus in the Eucharist is all we need. The Vatican, in its official communiques, spoke about the relic, but did not sufficiently highlight the symbolism of this heart. Much less did it explain the detail of the silence that accompanied it. Perhaps it did not consider it necessary or preferred to let each of the faithful freely interpret what happened. But for those who were paying attention, that gesture was the most profound moment of the ceremony, an instant in which the human and the divine met in a silent but evident way. In the tradition of the Church, the heart has always had a special value. Think of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, a symbol of divine love that gives itself to the extreme. Think also of the Immaculate Heart of Mary, who silently guards the mysteries of God. Now, Carlo's heart joins that same tradition, reminding us that holiness is nothing more than loving like Jesus and Mary, with a love that is not measured by words but by surrender. Dear viewer, I ask you directly, what does the heart as a symbol of faith mean to you? Do you feel that your own heart is centered on the essential, or is it scattered in secondary things? Leave me your answer in the comments, because I am convinced that reflecting on this sign can help all of us rediscover the importance of putting Christ at the center of our lives. The incredible detail of the canonization of Carlo Acutis, that unexpected silence next to the relic of his heart, is more than an anecdote. It is a reminder that God continues to speak to us in simple signs. The Vatican did not highlight it, but those with the eyes of faith know how to recognize that there was a profound message there. Holiness springs from a surrendered heart, silent, capable of loving without measure. Thus, Carlo's canonization was not only a solemn act in the Vatican, but also a personal invitation to every believer, an invitation to look at our own hearts and ask ourselves if they beat to the rhythm of the gospel, if they are willing to be transformed by the Eucharist, as Carlo was in his short but luminous life. One of the most striking aspects of the canonization of Carlo Acutis was the large presence of young people in St. Peter's Basilica. It was not a casual fact. Carlo was and continues to be a role model for new generations, an adolescent who loved soccer, technology, video games, but who at the same time had a profound spiritual life. He is today a powerful reference for those who believe that holiness is something unattainable. That day, between solemn chants and prayers, you could see groups of young people from different nationalities with flags, T-shirts with Carlo's image, and even with his phrases printed on them. The Eucharist is my highway to heaven. God does not ask us to be original, but authentic. The canonization was lived as a generational celebration, and in the midst of that youthful crowd, something very significant happened that connected with the hidden detail we have been talking about. When the relic of Carlo's heart was presented and that unexpected silence occurred, it was the young people who reacted with the greatest force. Many put their phones aside, knelt spontaneously, and began to pray in a low voice. In a world marked by noise and constant distraction, that moment of reverence was an impressive testimony that Carlo's holiness has the ability to touch the deepest fibers of new generations. The Vatican did not highlight this moment in its official communiques, but those who were there lived it as a clear sign. Carlo continues to evangelize to young people even after his death, and he does so with the same language as always, the silence that communicates more than 1,000 words, the authenticity that attracts more than any speech. Some young people later shared their impressions in interviews. An Italian girl said, "When I saw his heart, I felt that mine was also called to love Jesus more." A young man from Brazil commented, "I had never felt so much peace. I understood that I must return to Mass with more commitment." These voices are proof that Carlo has become a bridge between the Church and youth, a living example that holiness is possible in the daily life of any adolescent or young adult. That silence that the Vatican did not explain was transformed into a moment of conversion for many. It did not take a sermon or a liturgical instruction. The presence of a heart that spoke for itself and some young people willing to listen with faith was enough. The spontaneous reaction of the youth was, in reality, the most incredible detail of the canonization. Pope Leo XIV, in his homily, precisely highlighted this. Carlo shows that holiness is not a distant goal, but a vocation for everyone, especially for young people. His words resonated with force because they coincided with what was being experienced at that instant of silence, the experience that faith can transform the heart, even in the midst of a culture that often ignores it. The Church, which so often faces the challenge of attracting young people, found in Carlo a testimony that overcomes all barriers. It is not about complex pastoral strategies or media campaigns, but about the concrete life of a boy who discovered in the Eucharist the center of his existence. And at the canonization, that same message resonated in a palpable way, especially in the reaction of the young people who consider him one of their own. Dear viewer, here I want to invite you to participate in this moment. Do you believe that today's young people have in Carlo Acutis an authentic model of holiness? Leave me your answer in the comments. I am convinced that your words will enrich this dialogue and show how Carlo's figure can also inspire the new generations in your country or community. The incredible detail of the canonization, therefore, was not limited to the silence around the relic, but was amplified in the reaction of the young people. It was a moment in which it was clearly seen that Carlo is still alive in the hearts of those who seek meaning in the midst of the noise of modernity. The Vatican did not highlight it, but it was evident to all who witnessed it. Carlo's example has the power to provoke real conversions, to awaken vocations, to renew the faith of young people who often feel far from the Church. That day, in St. Peter's Basilica, they were not only celebrating the canonization of a saint, but also the beginning of a new stage for the Church, demonstrating that holiness is not reserved for the past, but can be embodied in a 21st century adolescent. And that message was engraved in the memory of those who lived that providential silence, accompanied by the spontaneous fervor of the youth. One cannot speak of Carlo Acutis without mentioning his mother, Antonia Salzano. Since the news of her son's canonization became known, her figure once again occupied an important place in the Catholic media, not as a protagonist, but as a privileged witness to Carlo's life and holiness. She was there in St. Peter's Basilica, in the front row, participating with a reverence and emotion that moved everyone present. For Antonia, Carlo's canonization was not only the Church's recognition of her son's life, but also the confirmation that everything he had lived and taught was in line with God's plan. She has always repeated that Carlo was no different from other young people, but that he knew how to put God first. And at the ceremony, while her son's heart was being presented as a relic, that conviction was transformed into a public testimony of faith. The hidden detail that marked the canonization, that unexpected silence during the presentation of the relic, also had a special echo in her. Although she did not publicly comment on that instant, those who accompanied her assure that she experienced it with a profound serenity, as if she understood that that silence was a prolongation of Carlo's spirituality, a heart that spoke without the need for words, a testimony that imposed itself on its own. After the ceremony, Antonia shared some reflections in interviews. She said that the most important thing for her was not the canonization itself, but that Carlo's example could inspire many young people to live the faith with joy and radicalism. Carlo taught me to put God first, she affirmed on one of those occasions, recalling how her own path of faith was strengthened thanks to her son's testimony. The Vatican, focused on the solemn organization of the canonization, did not highlight these personal aspects. But for those who follow Carlo's story closely, his mother's words and testimony are a fundamental key to understanding the impact of the event, because Antonia represents all the mothers who struggle to transmit the faith to their children in a world that is increasingly indifferent to God. And the fact that her son has reached the altars is a confirmation that this task is not in vain. During the ceremony, there was another significant moment that went almost unnoticed. When the procession with the relic concluded, the camera of the official broadcast briefly focused on Antonia's face. Her eyes were moist, but not from a heartbreaking sadness, but from a mixture of emotion and gratitude. It was the face of a mother who had offered God the most precious thing, her son, and who was now receiving the confirmation that that offering had borne fruit for the entire Church. Many of the faithful interpreted this gesture as a silent teaching. Holiness is not born in a vacuum, but in the heart of families that transmit faith, that teach to pray, that encourage going to Mass. Carlo would not have been who he was without his mother's influence, and the canonization, with all its splendor, is also a recognition of that quiet and persevering task. Dear viewer, here I want to make a special invitation to you. If you are a father or mother, how do you transmit the faith to your children? Leave it in the comments, because your testimony can inspire others. And if you do not have children, tell me what example of faith you received in your family, because I believe that we can all learn from those simple experiences that mark a life. The hidden detail of the canonization was not only the silence around the relic, but also the discreet protagonism of those who accompanied Carlo in life. His mother, with her serene presence, reminded everyone that a son's holiness is also the fruit of the parent's faith. And although the Vatican did not highlight it, this fact has an immense value in a time when so many families feel disoriented or unable to transmit the faith to new generations. The message is clear: holiness is not unattainable or reserved for a few privileged people. It arises from the everyday, from families that pray together, from parents who give testimony with their lives. Carlo became a saint because he put God at the center, but that path began in his home with a mother who accompanied and encouraged him. And at the canonization, that family testimony shone brightly, even if the Vatican did not mention it explicitly. The canonization ceremony, seen as a whole, was an event of faith, hope, and joy. But the incredible detail, that silence charged with meaning, and the contained tears of his mother remind us that holiness is, above all, a mystery of love lived in the hidden, and that even if Rome does not highlight it, it is those details that truly transform the hearts of the faithful. The canonization of Carlo Acutis not only moved the faithful but also generated a strong echo in the hierarchy of the Church. From cardinals to bishops from different continents, many publicly expressed their admiration for Carlo's life and their conviction that his example is a providential gift for the world today. However, something that drew attention was the way each one interpreted the ceremony and, in particular, that silent detail that the Vatican did not emphasize. In Rome, several prelates agreed that the canonization was a sign of hope in times of crisis. Pope Leo XIV highlighted that Carlo is a beacon of light for youth, emphasizing the need to rediscover the centrality of the Eucharist. But while the official speeches focused on this message, some bishops made more personal comments, pointing out that what impacted them the most was not what was said, but what was not said. A European cardinal interviewed by the press confessed that the moment of silence during the presentation of the relic was, for him, the strongest instant of the ceremony. He explained that in the midst of so much solemnity and so many words, that parenthesis without explanation was a reminder that holiness speaks for itself without the need for speeches. The Vatican, however, did not include these words in its official communiques, perhaps to avoid exaggerated interpretations. In Latin America, where Carlo has great devotion, several bishops highlighted the reaction of the young people. They pointed out that the detail of the silence coincided with an unusual reverence among them, as if Carlo's presence had become palpable. Some prelates affirmed that that moment was a living catechesis, more powerful than any homily because it showed how an adolescent can transform hearts even after his death. In Africa, bishops and priests highlighted another aspect, the universality of Carlo's message. They pointed out that although he was an Italian young man, his testimony resonates in very different contexts, from rural parishes to large cities. The detail of the silence was interpreted there as a sign that holiness is understandable in any culture because the language of the heart is universal. In Asia, some prelates remembered that in Eastern traditions, silence is a sign of the sacred. That is why that instant during the canonization was received as a moment of profound spiritual communion. They said it was not a mistake in the liturgy, but a providential sign that the Vatican did not need to explain because it was understood from faith. The interesting thing is that although the Vatican gave no official explanations about this detail, the bishops and cardinals from all over the world interpreted it in complementary ways. For some, it was a sign of the power of holiness. For others, a message for young people. For still others, a universal language of faith. And in all cases, the conclusion was the same. Carlo continues to evangelize even in silence. This diversity of interpretations shows something important. The canonization of Carlo Acutis was not just another event on the liturgical calendar, but an event that touched deep fibers in the universal church. And that incredible detail, not officially mentioned, became the center of many episcopal reflections. Dear viewer, I want to ask you, Do you believe the Church should speak more openly about these providential signs? Or is it better to leave them in silence for everyone to interpret in their heart? Leave your opinion in the comments. Your voice is important because this debate is not just theological, but also pastoral. How to transmit faith in a way that reaches everyone's heart. Some bishops also saw in the canonization a call for self-criticism. They pointed out that in a time when the Church is going through scandals and divisions, Carlo represents a fresh, transparent holiness without duplicity. His life reminds us that holiness does not depend on structures or strategies, but on a heart in love with God. And the silence during the ceremony was, for many, a reminder that the Church needs fewer words and more testimony. The Vatican, for its part, seems to have opted for prudence. It preferred not to give too much relevance to that detail, to avoid sensationalist interpretations. However, in the corridors of Rome, it is commented that it was one of the most talked about moments among the cardinals after the ceremony. Some called it a pause from God, others a liturgical detail charged with meaning. The truth is that no one was indifferent. Thus, what was not officially said ended up being the most remembered. The incredible detail that went unnoticed in the official communiques became the heart of the experience for bishops, priests, and the faithful. And that contrast between what the Vatican emphasizes and what the people perceive is perhaps the greatest lesson of the canonization of Carlo Acutis. Holiness is not always announced with microphones, but is revealed in the simple signs that God allows in the midst of the liturgy. The canonization of Carlo Acutis will remain in the memory of the Church as one of the most significant moments of our time, not only for the official recognition of a young man who lived the gospel radically, but also for that incredible detail that went unnoticed by many, the unexpected silence that accompanied the presentation of his heart as a relic. A silence that the Vatican did not highlight, but that was engraved in the hearts of those who lived it. In that instant, the universal Church received a profound lesson, because Carlo's message is not transmitted through elaborate speeches, but through the essential love for the Eucharist, the simplicity of a life given over to God, and the authenticity of a heart that knew how to put God first. That heart, now exposed as a relic, continues to speak more than any homily or official communique. The hidden detail reminds us of something fundamental. God manifests himself in the simple, in a world full of noise, constant news, scandals and controversies. The voice of God is heard in providential silences, in small gestures that have a transformative power. That is how it was in Carlo's life, and that is how it was in his canonization. The Vatican, perhaps out of prudence or the desire to avoid excessive interpretations, did not want to highlight that moment. But the truth is, it wasn't necessary, because holiness has a force that transcends any explanation. What millions of people saw and felt that day is enough to understand that Carlo continues to evangelize from heaven in the same way he did on earth, without noise, with simplicity, but with a profound impact. This detail also poses a challenge for the Church today. It invites us to reflect on how we transmit faith. We don't always need grand,